The sun hung high in the clear blue sky over the bustling town of Brookfield, casting long shadows across Main Street as townsfolk went about their daily routines. It was a picturesque afternoon, but beneath the idyllic surface, tension simmered. Officer Ethan Reynolds, a man in his late 40s with a reputation for being unyielding and brash, was parked in his squad car near a busy diner. Ethan was scanning the area with hawk-like precision, his radio crackling with intermittent chatter. To him, everything and everyone was a potential threat. Ethan had always prided himself on being a man of action, someone who didn't hesitate when his instincts kicked in. He considered himself a protector of Brookfield, even if his methods often raised eyebrows. Over the years, Ethan had garnered a reputation for being overly zealous, especially when it came to minorities in the predominantly white town. Complaints had been filed, meetings were held, and warnings were issued, but nothing ever seemed to stick. Ethan carried on as he always had, convinced he was doing what needed to be done. At that moment, Ethan's gaze locked onto a man standing beside a gleaming black luxury sedan, parked just outside the diner. The man, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, was scrolling through his phone. To most, he might have looked like a businessman on his lunch break, but to Ethan, something didn't sit right. He noticed the man glance around a few times, which Ethan immediately interpreted as suspicious behavior. His hand hovered over the radio, but instead, he decided to investigate personally. Ethan exited the car and adjusted his uniform, his badge glinting in the sunlight. As he approached the man, his boots clacked purposefully against the pavement. The man, oblivious to Ethan's approach, continued looking at his phone until Ethan's shadow loomed over him. "Excuse me, sir," Ethan said, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" The man looked up, his deep brown eyes meeting Ethan's with a calm yet slightly puzzled expression. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady and polite. Ethan immediately felt a surge of irritation. The man's composed demeanor struck him as defiance. "I ask you a question," Ethan pressed, stepping closer. "What are you doing near this vehicle?" The man raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. "I'm waiting for a colleague." "Is that a crime?" Ethan's hand instinctively rested on his holstered taser. "I need to see some identification," he demanded, ignoring the man's question. The man hesitated, his expression shifting to one of slight annoyance. "I don't see why that's necessary. I haven't done anything wrong." "That wasn't a request," Ethan snapped, his voice louder now, drawing the attention of a few passersby. "You're loitering around an expensive car, acting suspicious. I have every right to ask for your ID." The man sighed and reached into his jacket pocket, moving slowly. "Fine, if it'll make you feel better." He pulled out his wallet and handed over his ID. Ethan snatched it and scrutinized it, his eyes narrowing. The name on the ID read Marcus Bennett. Ethan frowned. The name seemed vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. "What's your business here, Mr. Bennett?" he asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. Marcus crossed his arms and leaned slightly against the car. "As I said, I'm waiting for a colleague." "Is that a problem?" Ethan's irritation boiled over into anger. "Step away from the vehicle," he barked. "I'm detaining you for further questioning." Marcus's calm demeanor wavered slightly as his brow furrowed. "Detaining me? On what grounds?" Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he reached for Marcus's arm, intending to cuff him. Marcus instinctively pulled back, his voice rising for the first time. "Hey, there's no need for this. I haven't done anything." By now, a small crowd had gathered, their murmurs filling the air. Some took out their phones, recording the escalating situation. A woman in her early 30s called out, "Officer, he hasn't done anything. Leave him alone." Ethan ignored the onlookers, focused entirely on Marcus. "Resisting, are we?" he said through gritted teeth, pulling out his cuffs. "You're only making this harder on yourself." Marcus stood firm, his voice now filled with authority that surprised even Ethan. "Officer Reynolds, I strongly suggest you stop and think about what you're doing." The use of his name startled Ethan. "How do you know my name?" he demanded, his grip tightening. Marcus stared at him, his voice calm yet commanding. "I know a lot more than you think." For a moment, Ethan hesitated, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down, especially not in front of an audience. He forcefully cuffed Marcus, pushing him towards the squad car. The crowd erupted in outrage, some shouting at Ethan, while others frantically dialed numbers on their phones. As he shoved Marcus into the back seat, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a quiet confidence in Marcus's demeanor, even in the face of what should have been a humiliating experience. It was unnerving. Ethan radioed in the arrest and drove to the station, his jaw clenched the entire way. The man in his backseat remained silent, staring out the window as if completely unfazed. Ethan glanced at him in the rearview mirror, frustration bubbling inside him. "You've got a lot of nerve," he muttered. Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady. "And you've got a lot to learn, officer." When they arrived at the station, Ethan marched Marcus inside, ignoring the curious glances from his colleagues. As he handed Marcus over to the booking officer, he finally began to relax, thinking the ordeal was over. But then, everything changed. A senior officer walked into the room, his eyes widening when he saw Marcus. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice booming. Ethan straightened up, trying to maintain his composure. "I detained this man for suspicious activity," he explained. "He was loitering near a high-end vehicle." The senior officer's face turned ashen. He looked at Marcus, then back at Ethan. "Do you have any idea who this is?" Ethan blinked, his confidence wavering. "He said his name is Marcus Bennett." The senior officer's voice dropped to a near whisper, filled with disbelief. "Marcus Bennett is the new police commissioner." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face as Marcus turned to him, a faint, almost pitying smile playing on his lips. "I tried to tell you," Marcus said quietly, "but you wouldn't listen." The room fell silent, save for the distant hum of office chatter. Ethan's career, his reputation, his very identity as an officer, all of it hung precariously in the balance. And in that moment, as he stood frozen in shock, he realized he had made the gravest mistake of his life. The moment Marcus Bennett's identity as the new police commissioner was revealed, a suffocating silence engulfed the station. Officer Ethan Reynolds stood motionless, his mind scrambling to process what had just happened. The man he had so arrogantly arrested wasn't some random suspect loitering near a luxury car. He was the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the region. Ethan's stomach churned as he caught sight of the senior officer's expression, a mix of fury, disbelief, and disappointment. Marcus stood calmly, his cuffed wrists resting in front of him. Despite the indignity of his situation, there was no rage in his eyes, only a quiet, piercing gaze that seemed to strip Ethan of his defenses. "Would someone mind removing these cuffs?" Marcus said, his voice steady but laced with authority. The senior officer, Captain Harris, snapped out of his stunned state and hurried to comply. "Of course, sir," he stammered, fumbling with the keys. As the cuffs fell away, Marcus rubbed his wrists and gave Harris a curt nod of thanks. Ethan's mouth went dry as Marcus turned to face him directly. The room seemed to shrink, and for the first time in his career, Ethan felt genuinely vulnerable. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some defense or explanation, but no words came out. His usual bravado had abandoned him. "Officer Reynolds," Marcus said, his tone calm but unyielding, "would you care to explain your actions today?" Ethan's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment before he managed to stammer. I thought you were acting suspicious, sir. I was just doing my job." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Your job," he repeated, almost as if testing the words. "Tell me, Officer Reynolds, what exactly did I do that warranted such suspicion?" Ethan floundered. He couldn't admit that his actions were driven by unconscious bias, or perhaps even something darker. Instead, he clung to the weak excuse he crafted earlier. You were standing near a high-value vehicle, looking around. It seemed unusual. The faintest flicker of amusement crossed Marcus's face, though it didn't reach his eyes. Looking around while standing near a car. I see. And that was enough to justify my arrest. Ethan felt the weight of every gaze in the room pressing down on him. His fellow officers were watching, their expressions ranging from shock to thinly veiled contempt. He knew that whatever he said next could either salvage or completely destroy his career, but the words that came to mind all felt hollow. Before Ethan could respond, Marcus raised a hand, silencing him. "We'll get back to that later," Marcus said, his voice taking on a colder edge. "Right now, I have other matters to address." Captain Harris immediately stepped forward, his posture rigid. "Sir, I can't express how deeply I regret this situation. Please know that Officer Reynolds' actions don't reflect the values of this department." Marcus glanced at him, his expression softening slightly. "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate your sentiment, but words alone won't resolve this. I'll be conducting a full review of this department's practices, starting with today's incident." Harris nodded quickly, his face pale. "Understood, sir. We'll fully cooperate." Marcus turned his attention back to Ethan, his gaze sharp. "Officer Reynolds, I'd advise you to take some time to reflect on your actions. For now, consider yourself suspended pending further investigation." Ethan's heart sank. He opened his mouth to protest, but Marcus had already turned away, effectively ending the conversation. The room erupted into a flurry of hushed whispers as Marcus exited, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Ethan felt like the walls were closing in on him. He could barely hear Harris instructing him to hand over his badge and weapon. His mind was too preoccupied with the devastating realization that his career, everything he had worked for, was hanging by a thread. Reluctantly, he removed his badge and placed it on the desk, the metallic clang echoing in his ears like a death knell. The walk to his car felt like a funeral procession. Colleagues avoided meeting his eyes, their expressions a mixture of pity and disdain. As he slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, he couldn't shake the image of Marcus's calm yet piercing stare. It haunted him, filling him with a gnawing sense of shame he couldn't ignore. Ethan drove endlessly for hours, replaying the events of the day over and over in his mind. Every decision he'd made, every word he'd spoken, seemed more damning with each recollection. He thought about the crowd that had gathered during the arrest, the way they had looked at him, not with respect or admiration, but with anger and disgust. And then there was Marcus, standing tall and composed despite the humiliation Ethan had inflicted upon him. It wasn't until dusk that Ethan finally parked at a secluded spot near the river, a place he often visited to clear his mind. He sat there in silence, staring at the water as the sky turned shades of orange and pink. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to confront the truth he had been avoiding for so long. His actions had been wrong, not just today, but for years. Ethan thought about the complaints filed against him, the countless warnings he had brushed off as overreactions. He had always justified his behavior by telling himself he was enforcing the law, but now he realized that he had been enforcing his own prejudices. The truth was as cold and unrelenting as the river current before him. As night fell, Ethan's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text message from his wife, asking when he'd be home. He stared at the screen, feeling a pang of guilt. How could he face her after everything that had happened? How could he face anyone? He closed his eyes and leaned back in his seat, the weight of the day pressing down on him like a physical burden. Tomorrow, he knew, would bring questions, judgments, and consequences. But tonight, all he could do was sit in the stillness, grappling with the person he had been and the person he desperately wanted to become. The next morning, the weight of the previous day lingered heavily on Ethan Reynolds as he walked into the kitchen of his modest home. The scent of coffee drifted through the air, but it did little to lift his spirits. His wife, Karen, stood by the counter, her back turned to him. She was scrolling through her phone, and from the stiffness of her posture, Ethan could tell she had already seen the news. "Morning," he said cautiously, trying to gauge her mood. Karen set her phone down with deliberate care and turned to face him. Her expression was a mixture of disappointment and concern. "I didn't expect to wake up to videos of you plastered all over social media," she said, her voice clipped. Ethan sighed and ran a hand over his face. "It's not what it looks like, Karen. Isn't it?" She shot back. "Because what it looks like is my husband handcuffing our new police commissioner in front of half the town. Do you know how humiliating this is for our family?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond but stopped himself. What could he say? That he'd been doing his job? That he hadn't known who Marcus was? Both excuses felt hollow, even to him. Karen shook her head and turned back to the counter. "You need to fix this, Ethan. I don't know how, but you can't just let it end like this." Ethan wanted to argue, to tell her that it wasn't that simple, but deep down, he knew she was right. He grabbed his coffee and sat at the table, his mind racing. What could he do? Apologize? Beg for forgiveness? The idea made him cringe, but the alternative, losing everything, was even worse. Later that morning, Ethan drove to the station, though he wasn't technically supposed to be there. The atmosphere was tense as he walked through the doors. Conversations hushed, and all eyes seemed to follow him as he made his way to the captain's office. Captain Harris was seated behind his desk, flipping through a stack of papers. He looked up when Ethan entered, his expression stern. "You're not supposed to be here, Reynolds," Harris said, leaning back in his chair. "I know," Ethan replied, closing the door behind him. "But I need to talk to you." Harris folded his arms across his chest. "You've got 5 minutes." Ethan hesitated, searching for the right words. "I need to know where I stand, Captain. What happens next?" Harris studied him for a moment before letting out a long sigh. "What happens next depends entirely on Commissioner Bennett. He's the one calling the shots now." Ethan felt a cold knot of fear tighten in his stomach. What does that mean? Is he going to press charges? Harris shook his head. "I don't know. But if I were you, I'd prepare for the worst. Bennett's not the type to let something like this slide." The rest of the day passed in a haze of anxiety. Ethan tried to distract himself by cleaning the house, going for a run, anything to keep his mind off the impending fallout. But no matter what he did, the image of Marcus's calm, piercing gaze lingered in his thoughts. By evening, the news was everywhere. Local channels ran stories about the incident, complete with cell phone footage from multiple angles. Social media was even worse, with hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #FieryOfficerReynolds trending. Ethan's name had become a lightning rod for outrage, and the comments were brutal. Strangers called him everything from a racist to a disgrace, and some even went so far as to threaten him. Karen sat beside him on the couch, scrolling through her own phone. "You should stay off social media," she said, her tone softer than before. "It's only going to make you feel worse." "I deserve it," Ethan muttered, his eyes fixed on the television. A reporter was interviewing a witness from the diner, a middle-aged woman who described the arrest as blatant racial profiling. Karen glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Do you?" Ethan turned to her, surprised. "What's that supposed to mean?" Karen shrugged. "You've always been so sure of yourself, Ethan. So convinced that you were right, no matter what anyone else said. Maybe this is what it takes to make you realize you're not perfect." Her words stung, but they also struck a chord. Ethan had spent his entire career brushing off criticism, believing that his actions were justified because he was enforcing the law. But now, for the first time, he was forced to confront the possibility that he had been wrong, not just about Marcus, but about everything. The next morning, Ethan received an email from the department instructing him to attend a meeting at City Hall. The email didn't provide any details, but Ethan knew it had to be about the incident. He arrived early, dressed in his best suit, his nerves frayed. The large conference room was already filling with people, city officials, community leaders, and members of the press. At the head of the table sat Marcus Bennett, his expression calm but unreadable. Ethan's heart sank as he took a seat near the back of the room. The meeting began with opening remarks from the mayor, who expressed his disappointment in the department and his commitment to addressing systemic issues. Then, Marcus stood and addressed the room. "Yesterday's incident was unfortunate," he began, his voice steady. "But it was also an opportunity, a chance to confront the biases and failures that have plagued this community for far too long." Ethan listened intently, his chest tightening with each word. Marcus spoke with a quiet authority that commanded respect, outlining his plans for reforming the department and rebuilding trust between the police and the community. His words were met with applause, but Ethan couldn't bring himself to clap. When Marcus finished, the mayor opened the floor for questions. To Ethan's surprise, Marcus called on him first. "Officer Reynolds," Marcus said, his gaze locking onto Ethan's. "Do you have anything you'd like to say?" Ethan felt every eye in the room turn toward him. He hesitated, his palms sweating. This was his chance to explain himself, to make amends. But as he stood, he realized that words alone wouldn't be enough. I made a mistake," Ethan began, his voice shaking. "A terrible mistake. And I take full responsibility for my actions. I'm sorry for what I did, not just to you, Commissioner, but to everyone I've let down." The room was silent for a moment before Marcus spoke. "Apologies are a start, Officer Reynolds, but actions speak louder than words. Are you willing to take responsibility and help us make real change?" Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, sir, whatever it takes." Marcus studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. "Then let's get to work." As the meeting continued, Ethan felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't erase the damage he had done, but he was determined to make things right. For the first time in his life, he was ready to listen, to learn, and to change. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Ethan knew it was a journey he had to take. The days that followed the City Hall meeting were a whirlwind of activity and self-reflection for Ethan Reynolds. He wasn't just dealing with the fallout from his actions. He was also navigating a world that suddenly felt unrecognizable. The badge that had once given him a sense of authority and purpose was now a heavy reminder of his failures. Suspended and under investigation, Ethan's life had been reduced to introspection, community forums, and mandated bias training sessions. The first session was scheduled just days after the meeting. Ethan arrived at the community center early, dressed in plain clothes. He felt exposed without his uniform, like a soldier stripped of armor. The room was already filling with attendees, officers from the department, local activists, and even a few civilians who had been invited to participate. Ethan recognized some of the faces from the diner on the day of the incident, and their presence only deepened his sense of unease. The facilitator, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Lillian Myers, was a renowned expert in community police relations. She began the session with a simple but disarming question. "When you look at someone, what's the first thing you notice?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat as people around the room began to answer. "Their demeanor," one officer said. "Their body language," another added. Ethan remained silent, unsure of what to say. When Dr. Myers' gaze finally landed on him, he felt his chest tighten. "Officer Reynolds," she prompted gently, "what about you?" He hesitated, then spoke the truth. "Their appearance," he admitted. "I noticed their appearance." Dr. Myers nodded, her expression neutral. "And why do you think that is?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond but stopped. The answer was so deeply ingrained in him that he couldn't immediately articulate it. "I guess I've always been taught to look for what seems out of place," he said finally. Dr. Myers smiled faintly. "And what defines out of place for you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan felt the weight of every eye in the room on him. "I don't know," he said quietly. "Maybe I need to figure that out." The session continued, delving into the psychology of bias and the ways it manifests in everyday interactions. For Ethan, it was like peeling back the layers of a wound he hadn't realized was there. He thought about his upbringing, his early years in the police academy, and the countless encounters that had shaped his worldview. He thought about Marcus Bennett, standing calmly as Ethan cuffed him, and the quiet power in his eyes that had cut through Ethan's bravado. After the session, Ethan lingered in the parking lot, his mind racing. He was about to leave when he heard a voice behind him. Officer Reynolds. He turned to see Marcus Bennett approaching, his stride confident and purposeful. For a moment, Ethan considered making an excuse and walking away, but something in Marcus's expression stopped him. "Commissioner," Ethan said, his voice stiff with discomfort. Marcus nodded in acknowledgement. "How was the session?" "It was eye-opening," Ethan admitted. "I've got a lot to think about." Marcus studied him for a moment, then said, "That's a start. But thinking isn't enough. What are you going to do with what you've learned?" The question hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He had spent so much time feeling sorry for himself that he hadn't considered what real change would look like. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but I want to do better." Marcus's expression softened slightly. "That's good to hear. Because change isn't just about you, Officer Reynolds. It's about the impact you have on the people around you, on this community." Ethan nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. "I want to make things right, whatever it takes." Marcus's gaze remained steady. "We'll see if you mean that." The following week, Ethan was invited to a community forum organized by Marcus. The event was held in the same diner where the incident had occurred, a deliberate choice meant to foster dialogue and healing. Ethan was nervous as he walked through the doors, his palms slick with sweat. The diner was packed with people, residents, activists, business owners, and even a few of his former colleagues. Marcus stood at the front of the room, speaking about the importance of accountability and the need for systemic change. When he finished, he turned to the crowd and said, "Before we open the floor for discussion, I'd like to invite someone to share their perspective." Officer Reynolds. Ethan's heart pounded as he made his way to the front. He hadn't expected to speak, and the weight of the crowd's gaze felt almost unbearable. He took a deep breath and began. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from," he said, his voice shaky. "And I don't blame you. What I did was wrong. There's no excuse for it. But I'm here because I want to listen. I want to understand how I can help fix what I've broken." The room was silent for a moment, and Ethan braced himself for hostility. Instead, a woman in the front row, a young mother holding her toddler, spoke up. "What made you think he was suspicious?" she asked, her tone sharp but not unkind. Ethan swallowed hard. "Honestly, I let my assumptions guide me. I saw someone who didn't fit what I thought belonged, and I acted on those assumptions without thinking." Another voice chimed in, this time an older man. "And how do we know you won't do it again?" Ethan met the man's gaze. "Because I'm not the same person I was that day. I'm learning. I'm growing. And I'm willing to be held accountable." For the next hour, Ethan answered questions, listened to grievances, and absorbed the stories of people whose trust in law enforcement had been shattered long before his incident with Marcus. It was humbling, painful, and necessary. By the end of the forum, Ethan felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus approached him. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said. "Thanks," Ethan replied. "But I've got a long way to go." Marcus nodded. "We all do." That night, as Ethan sat in his car outside the diner, he thought about the road ahead. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He was ready to rebuild, not just for himself, but for the community he had sworn to serve. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was truly earning the badge he had so long taken for granted. In the weeks that followed the community forum, Ethan Reynolds found himself at the center of a movement that was reshaping not just his life, but the entire town of Brookfield. Marcus Bennett had made it clear that reform wasn't optional, it was mandatory. The incident at the diner had become a flashpoint for long-simmering tensions, and now, the town demanded change. For Ethan, that meant more than just apologizing. It meant taking action, even if it was uncomfortable. One of the first steps Marcus insisted on was that Ethan join a new community outreach program designed to bridge the gap between law enforcement and residents. The program involved everything from ride-alongs with local activists to participating in neighborhood meetings. At first, Ethan approached the assignments with a sense of obligation, but as he immersed himself in the community, his perspective began to shift. One evening, he found himself in a modest church basement packed with community members. The air buzzed with a mixture of hope and skepticism. The meeting was led by a woman named Regina, a longtime activist who had been a thorn in the side of the police department for years. Regina was a force of nature, her voice commanding and her passion undeniable. "Tonight, we're going to talk about trust," Regina began, pacing the room with an energy that drew everyone in. "Specifically, how we rebuild it. Because let's be honest, trust between this community and the police, it's shattered." She turned to Ethan, her piercing gaze locking onto him. "Officer Reynolds, do you think this community trusts you?" Ethan shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of the question. "No," he admitted, "and I don't blame them." Regina nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Good. Admitting that is the first step. Now, what are you going to do about it?" Ethan took a deep breath and stood. "I can't undo the harm I've caused," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "But I can start by listening, by showing up, and by proving, through my actions, that I'm committed to doing better." The room was silent for a moment. Then Regina smiled faintly. "Actions speak louder than words, officer. Let's see if you mean it." The next few weeks were grueling. Ethan spent hours in training sessions, learning about implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and the history of systemic racism in law enforcement. He volunteered for every community event he could, from food drives to youth mentorship programs. At first, the residents were wary of his presence, their eyes filled with mistrust. But slowly, as they saw his consistent efforts, some began to soften. One day, while volunteering at a local after-school program, Ethan had a breakthrough moment. He was helping a group of kids with their homework when a young boy named Jamal hesitated before approaching him. Jamal, no more than 10 years old, held out a crumpled piece of paper. "What's this?" Ethan asked gently. It's my drawing," Jamal said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to show you." Ethan unfolded the paper and was taken aback. The drawing depicted a police officer standing beside a child, both smiling. "Did you draw this?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine admiration. Jamal nodded, a shy smile creeping across his face. "Yeah, it's what I hope cops can be like." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He looked at Jamal, his throat tightening. "Thank you for sharing this with me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm going to do everything I can to live up to this." Moments like these became small but powerful reminders of why Ethan was doing this work. Yet, not everyone was ready to forgive. There were still those who viewed him as a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. One particularly vocal critic was an older man named Frank, whose son had been wrongfully arrested years earlier. Frank attended every forum and meeting, his words sharp and uncompromising. "You think showing up to a few meetings makes up for what you've done," Frank said at one forum, his voice echoing in the room. "You think a little community service erases years of harm." Ethan didn't flinch. "No," he said, meeting Frank's gaze. "I don't think anything I do will ever erase the harm. But I'm not here to erase it. I'm here to own it. And to do better." Frank stared at him for a long moment before finally nodding, though his expression remained guarded. "We'll see," he said gruffly. As Ethan worked to rebuild trust, Marcus was busy overhauling the department. He implemented mandatory training programs, increased accountability measures, and created a civilian oversight board. The changes weren't universally welcomed. Some officers bristled at the new policies, viewing them as unnecessary or punitive. But Marcus was unyielding. One afternoon, Marcus called Ethan into his office. The walls were lined with awards and commendations, a testament to Marcus's storied career. He gestured for Ethan to sit, his expression unreadable. "You've been making progress," Marcus said, his tone measured. "But progress isn't the same as change. Do you understand the difference?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Progress is temporary. Change is permanent." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying him. "Good, because change takes time, and it's not always easy. You've taken the first steps, but there's still a long road ahead. Are you ready for that?" "Yes, sir," Ethan said without hesitation. Marcus's expression softened slightly. "Good, because I'm going to hold you to it." As the months passed, Ethan's efforts began to bear fruit. Relationships that had once been strained began to mend, and while not everyone was ready to forgive, there was a growing sense of hope in the community. Ethan found himself rediscovering why he had joined the force in the first place, not to wield power, but to serve and protect. One evening, as Ethan was leaving the station, he found Marcus waiting for him outside. "Walk with me," Marcus said. They strolled through the quiet streets of Brookfield, the fading sunlight casting long shadows on the pavement. "You've come a long way," Marcus said after a while. "But the work is never done. You understand that, right?" Ethan nodded. "I do, and I'm ready to keep going." Marcus stopped and turned to face him. "Good, because this isn't just about you, Reynolds. It's about what you represent. If you can change, maybe others can too." The words resonated deeply with Ethan. As they continued walking, he felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't just rebuilding his career, he was helping to rebuild a community. And for the first time, he believed in the possibility of lasting change. Months turned into a year, and Ethan Reynolds had become a fixture in the Brookfield community, not as a feared officer of the law, but as a man working to rebuild trust and prove that change was possible. His journey was far from over, but the milestones he had achieved were undeniable. Relationships with community members, once steeped in distrust, were slowly turning into partnerships. And yet, Ethan knew that the shadow of his past actions still loomed large over his every step. The final test of his transformation came unexpectedly during a town hall meeting. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Marcus Bennett, ever the composed leader, stood at the podium addressing the crowd about the progress made in the police department. His reforms had taken root, but he acknowledged that there was still much work to be done. "Tonight," Marcus said, his voice steady, "I want to share a story. A story about accountability, growth, and what it means to truly serve a community." Ethan, seated near the back, felt the weight of Marcus's words. He knew this story was about him. "Last year," Marcus continued, "an incident occurred that shook this town. An officer, blinded by his biases, made a grave mistake. That mistake could have ended his career. It could have deepened the divide between this community and those sworn to protect it. But something different happened. That officer chose to face his failures head-on. He chose to listen, to learn, and to grow." The crowd murmured, and Ethan felt their collective gaze shift toward him. Marcus stepped aside, gesturing for Ethan to join him at the podium. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then stood, his heart pounding in his chest. As he walked to the front of the room, the murmurs grew louder, a mixture of curiosity and skepticism rippling through the crowd. Ethan took a deep breath as he faced the audience. "A year ago," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I made a decision that I'll regret for the rest of my life. I let my prejudices guide me, and I hurt not just one man, but an entire community. That day forced me to confront a truth I had been avoiding for years, that I was part of the problem." He paused, scanning the room. He saw familiar faces: Regina, who had challenged him at every turn; Frank, who had been one of his harshest critics; and even Jamal, the young boy whose drawing had given Ethan hope. I won't stand here and tell you that I fixed everything, because I haven't. But what I can say is that I've committed myself to change, not just as an officer, but as a person. I've learned that change isn't a destination. It's a process. And it's a process I'll be working on for the rest of my life. The room was silent for a moment. Then a single voice called out, "What have you done to prove it?" Ethan turned toward the voice. It was Frank, standing near the back of the room, his arms crossed. "Fair question," Ethan said. "I spent the past year working with this community. I've attended every forum, every training session, and every outreach event I could. I've listened to your stories, your struggles, and your hopes. And I've done my best to support the changes that Commissioner Bennett has brought to this department. But more than that, I've tried to live differently, to be the kind of officer and the kind of person that this town deserves." Frank's expression was unreadable, but he nodded slightly before sitting down. The tension in the room eased, and Ethan continued, "I know I still have a lot to prove, and I know that not everyone will forgive me. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Because this community deserves better, and I'm committed to being better." When he finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. It wasn't unanimous. Some people clapped hesitantly, while others remained silent. But it was more than Ethan had dared to hope for. He stepped away from the podium, his chest tight with emotion, and Marcus clapped him on the shoulder as he passed. After the meeting, Ethan stayed behind, helping to clean up the room. As he stacked chairs, Regina approached him, her arms crossed and a skeptical look on her face. "You've come a long way," she said, "but don't think for a second that I'm going to stop holding you accountable." Ethan smiled faintly. "I wouldn't expect anything less." She studied him for a moment, then extended her hand. "Keep proving me wrong, Reynolds." He shook her hand, feeling a sense of relief and gratitude. "I will." Later that night, Ethan sat on his porch, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. The stars were bright, the air cool and crisp. He thought about Marcus, whose unwavering commitment to justice had set the tone for the department's transformation. He thought about the community, whose resilience and willingness to engage had made his redemption possible. And he thought about himself, the man he had been, and the man he was striving to become. As he sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Marcus. It read, "Proud of you tonight. Change isn't easy, but you're doing the work. Keep it up." Ethan smiled, feeling a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in years. The road ahead was still long, and the work was far from over. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path, and he was ready to keep walking it, one step at a time.